Hello everybody, very warm welcome to today's panel on water. First of all, I'd love to introduce you to myself first. I'm Clare Mike. I'm Director of Technical and Business Development at LEAF, which stands for Linking Environment and Farming. We're a charity that helps farmers to farm more sustainably. We have a standard that farmers can work towards, the LEAF Mark standard, and we work with a variety of stakeholders in the agricultural sector. And I'm delighted today to be joined by a wonderful panel. So we've got Chris Newenham from Wilkin & Sons. We've got Mark Knight from Tangmere Nurseries, and we've got Kirsty Brannan from Oakbank Game and Conservation, and they're going to introduce themselves a little bit more in their businesses in a second. But I just thought I'd open with some thoughts. Increasing the proportion of fruit and vegetables in our diets is an important objective that's been flagged by the National Food Strategy. But many of the countries that we source the UK's produce from are water stressed. There's a lack of water already, limiting growth of our horticulture sector, among other areas. Agriculture is responsible for 70% of the world's fresh water withdrawals and up to 90% in some developing countries, according to the World Bank. This means that there is a critical need to safeguard water supplies domestically and internationally. And as we all know, over the last couple of days, that's all come to the forefront. And we need to really ensure that resilient supply of food and drink products and ingredients into the future. And water is really at the source of that, literally. Global demand for water is projected by the Food and Agricultural Organization to increase by 50% by 2030, and the UN projects a 40% global water shortfall by 2030. In RAP's fairly recently published Water Roadmap, it states that protecting critical water sources for food supply and for nature and local communities is really critical. The roadmap sets out the vision and key pathways to address those challenges that we collectively face in protecting those critical water resources. And within the roadmap, and reflected in WWF's basket metric, for example, to which a great many number of retail supply chains and brands have committed, there is a target that at least 50% of fresh food will be sourced from areas with sustainable water management. Although critically at the moment, it's not entirely clear on the definition of either what constitutes sustainable water management or how it could be measured. And obviously that's a big challenge for water right now. Speaking to various stakeholders within the industry, this remains a blocker when it comes to the question of sound water stewardship. What does it look like? How do we measure it? Who's responsible for it? What we do know, regardless of agreeing to this detail, is that water management is critical, particularly as part of an integrated farm management approach. And yet, whilst we hear so much about soil, carbon, biodiversity, perhaps we don't talk enough about water. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce my fellow panelists today, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, a little bit about their business, and I'd also like you to tell me why you are interested in water. So, Chris.
Okay, thank you, Claire. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for turning out so late in the day. It's nice to have a few people in the audience. My name's Chris Newenham. I'm Joint Managing Director of Wilkin & Sons in Tiptree. Hopefully you're all, or a few of you, are aware of the Tiptree brand. So we're a vertically integrated business. We go right through from primary production in the field, and we're manufacturers and manufacturers of Tiptree jams and a range of savouries besides. But we are a vertically integrated business. Lots of fruit production in the fields. We farm in the driest part of the driest county. Our average rainfall is about 500 mils, 20 inches. So careful use of water is absolutely critical. We have various constraints on growth. We have had historically labour as a fruit producer is obviously a continual concern. But beyond that, water has been our number one constraint on growth. And we've been on quite a journey, which we'll come back to talk about, in terms of water management, water conservation, careful use of water over the last 15 years or so. But I'll hand over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Leaf for the invitation. I work for Tangmere Airfield Nurseries Limited as their technical crops manager. Tangmere specialises in growing sweet peppers under glass on our site in West Sussex for the last 30 years. We also have a site in Spain to complement the UK site production, which has been in production for over 20 years. All our crops are grown hydroponically using rock wool. This means as a grower we control the amount of water and fertiliser a plant receives. I've had a real passion to understand better the water needs of a plant and how this can be put into practice through the uptake of new technology and sharing knowledge. It's a tool, and the more we understand it, the better we can use it. Water is definitely a resource that is moving up the agenda currently, and more attention is being focused on it in the public arena. As growers, we need to demonstrate to everybody that is interested in whatever capacity that we use this precious resource wisely.
Thank you, Mark. And Kirsty.
Thank you, Claire. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Kirsty Brannan, and I'm a Senior Farm Conservation Advisor with Oakbank Game and Conservation. I do a lot of work with schemes such as countryside stewardship across England, which you'll be very familiar with, working with estates as well as family farms, and also using some of the newer tools that you'll have heard about recently, such as biodiversity net gain, basically things that get conservation done on the ground. I also work with several farm clusters in central England, helping them to not only identify where their efforts can make the biggest environmental difference, but also what sources of support are available to them to actually get that change done, and also to value existing good delivery. Oakbank, if you've not come across us before, we're specialists in farm conservation. We provide conservation advice, we provide conservation seed mixes, and we have specialists in a number of areas, from woodland to game covers to cover cropping. A lot of our clients will increasingly find this issue of water management is so important to them, because we see our climate changing before our very eyes, and people are having to adapt to get ahead of that and manage some of the challenges that brings.
Thank you, Kirsty. So I want to drill a little bit deeper into how you manage, or you help farmers to manage water, and how you've adapted to some of those water security issues. So, Chris, can I start with you, please? How do you deal with the challenges of farming in the driest part of the country, and how's your business adapted over the years?
Okay. I've tried to summarise it fairly succinctly as the 5 R's, but I'll come back and tease that out. That's reducing, reusing, recycling, reservoirs, resilience. I think if we go back about 20 years ago, we were very standard in our approach. We were using spray irrigation throughout the farm. And we were struggling both with the range of crops and the volume of crops that we were able to grow. So if we were going to continue to evolve as a farming business, we needed to adapt our approach in terms of water. So the first step on that journey for us was into trickle irrigation. So our first foray was back in about 2002, 2003. And at that time, we were growing in the soil, we were growing on raised beds, and then our growing systems have gradually developed. We are primarily soft and cane fruit growers, I should say, but we do have a fairly substantial area of orchard as well. So particularly in reference to our soft and our cane fruit, we've gradually moved out of the soil into substrate, into growing in grow bags, initially on beds, and then we've moved to tabletop production. And in their current iteration, we're now in an oscillating tabletop type system, which is very, very intensive in terms of cropped area. So we moved into trickle irrigation. We then, in 2010, and I should say that we've got no groundwater abstraction available to us. It's all via winter fill reservoirs, so it's all captured and stored water. There was a lot of investment put into Essex and Suffolk back in the 70s into building resilience through building reservoirs, but we built some pretty small reservoirs and had a network of fairly small reservoirs, so limited water available to us. And meanwhile, we have a factory that's manufacturing food. That's got an allied wastewater treatment plant, and that seemed like a missed opportunity to us because all the washdown water that was coming out of our factory was being lost to us on the farm. We thought, wouldn't it be quite nice if we could start to find a mechanism to use that water? But you start analysing these things, and the agronomists come to you and they have a look at your water analysis and they say, well, you've got no business growing fruit in this part of the world. You know, your water quality is just not suitable. It's highly saline. And we thought, okay, are we going to accept that, or are we actually going to find a way of trying to make our water work? So we scratched our heads a bit. This is moving on to 2010 now. We're scratching our heads thinking, who is good at using water and who's got some pretty lousy water available to them? And we hit upon Israel. And the Israelis have obviously not got a lot of water available. They've got some really challenging water to work with. And they were very innovative in terms of the systems that they'd put in to manage and to use water. So we spent some time in Israel looking at what they were doing. We tied up with an Israeli irrigation provider, and we put in a system which was called Auto Agronom at that point in time, which was industry, in my humble opinion, industry leading. It was not technology that was being employed in the UK at that point in time, and that provided us with an initial mechanism to use our otherwise unacceptable water. Their approach was very different. We could spend all afternoon talking about that, and I think we've not got time for that. But it allowed us to start using our water. So that was about using the opportunities we had available and making them work. And then beyond that, it was about improving our resilience. So we had a network of small reservoirs that provided us with enough water but to manage the crops we currently had, but not allowing us to grow either the range or the volume of fruit that we would like to grow, and we wanted to continue expanding our production. So in 2017, we eventually got planning permission. Actually, we got planning permission under permitted development rights rather than having to go into a full planning permission for two 70,000 cubic meter storage reservoirs. And that's been a game changer for us. That's given us the storage capacity and the resilience that we need to be able to carry on producing. We've had various other innovations that have come in since then. Our water is still challenging. The nature of the fact that we're using recycled water always presents problems, but we've started using ozone nanobubbles in our water, which is helping to clean the water up. We are continuing to put systems in place to harvest water. So we're now growing, in terms of our strawberry production, our raspberry production, we're growing on a gutter system. So any water that now drains from the plants gets channeled back into a storage container and gets mixed back into our water. So it's an absolutely virtuous system. Nothing is wasted. Yeah, I think that's probably enough, just in terms of bringing you up to speed where we are currently.
Thank you, Chris.
So
yes, more than enough. And it's really interesting that the use of the word resilience so much in there, actually, because it's so critical. Water is so critical to that, building that resilient agricultural business. Mark, I've had the great pleasure of visiting Tangmere Nurseries and hearing all about your circular approaches that you adopt there. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, if that's okay, or for you to introduce that to the audience. And have you learnt any lessons from operating in Spain that are now relevant to the UK as well?
Yes, we have. Obviously, Spain is a much more challenging environment to grow in. And as I said in the introduction, we've got a nursery over there that we built 20 years ago. And some of the learnings with particularly water use, but also the water demands on the crop as well. And what we're seeing is that in this country, it's following the weather in Spain, and the weather in Spain is definitely becoming drier and warmer. And we see temperatures now, even last weekend where we're growing, it was 42 degrees at the weekend. So that's pretty warm, and they normally would have been temperatures that we would have seen later in the year, more in the August time. So we are growing all the crops hydroponically, and we are growing the same varieties as well between the two nurseries, so the UK site and the Spain site. We've got the same technology, and what we're doing is, in some ways similar to Chris, we're in a substrate, we're growing in rock wool all of the crops. They're in metal gutters, and it allows us to collect the drain, which is the water that you don't need. Now, if you grow a crop in rock wool, you will need to over-irrigate it. You need to have, and that's to create an evenness within the slab that the plant's growing in. So you always overwater to get a nice evenness, both of water content, but also of the fertiliser that's in the water as well. And we collect all of that water because we're on metal gutters. That all gets collected. But what we do is we treat it with an ultraviolet filter. So that will remove or reduce the harmful pathogens that are present, and then we will then blend that with the water, with fresh feed and fresh water. So the plant effectively gets a cocktail back again. Now that's a very good system, but you need to be very aware of the plant, what it's taking, and actually what it's leaving behind, because you've got the feed, so that's what you're giving the plant, so you know exactly what's in that, but you've also got the drain, and you're very aware of what that is, so you know what the plant's taking. And as a grower, you're aware of some plants, they will, or plants in general, pepper plants specifically, they will be like a child in a sweet shop with certain nutrients, and they will just take them and keep taking them. Even if it's not good for them, they keep taking it. And other things you need to. So you need to take a mineral analysis on a regular basis. We do it weekly to be aware of the balance that you've got, so you can make adjustments in the feed that you make for the crop. So you're really looking quite carefully at what the plant is taking and what the plant's leaving behind, but also you're very appreciative of the plant's needs as well, because our crops are planted out in December, where they're a very small plant, and then as the days become longer in January, the plant will allow it to set, and it will have a different nutrient requirement if it's in a fruiting stage than if it's in a growth stage. So we're very, very careful with that. And I think also we're just learning all the time, really, what the parameters of what we're doing are, and looking at Spain, with the management of the plant. We shade the crop, and in Spain we were shading the crop because we needed to, because of the temperatures and the intensity of the light. What we started to realise now in the UK that we have to also shade over here. So some of the lessons we've learnt in Spain we're applying over here, because we're actually looking at the evaporation of the crop and trying to reduce the evaporation through shading, so that the plant is not overly stressed. Because if a plant becomes overly stressed, I'm sure you're aware, you get some challenges with the way the plant's growing or the quality of the fruit that it's producing. So we're learning a lot of that in Spain, and we're applying quite a bit of that in the UK, as it seems that our climate is changing, at least at the moment, to a warmer, drier period. Although I have to say it was fairly dull at the start of this year, but nature has a lovely way of making back up for it, and we saw very, very, very high light. And maybe some of that would have been due. I was speaking to an agronomist, And he said that the intensity of the light that we saw in this country was due to the fact that a lot of the heavy industry in Poland and in that part of the world wasn't that active, and the wind that was bringing it over didn't have a lot of pollution in it, but also didn't have a lot of water in it either, because it was northeasterlies. So the light could come through, and it was very, very clear and very bright, and that is quite stressful for a crop. So we were shading, and we're also learning what the parameters of the shading is as growers, but also we've got support in understanding where are the boundaries of what you can do with the plant, what's good stress, and when does it become negative stress for the plant. So I hope that answers some of your question, Claire.
And it's fascinating to understand that, you know, things that are happening so far away can have an impact over here. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Kirsty, we've just heard some really great examples there about water in a fairly localised system. What I'd love to ask you is, how have you worked with farmers at that landscape scale to protect and conserve water?
Yeah, it's fascinating hearing some of those principles, and I'm thinking about how those apply to some of the farmers that I work with. So most of the farmers that I'm supporting are either arable or mixed with livestock, beef and sheep. We don't have too many soft fruit, horticulture, or pigs and dairy in my particular area. But some of the principles that you were just talking about are exactly the same. So some of the challenges that the farmers I'm seeing are trying to deal with are not only including drought, as is very topical at the moment, but we're seeing when rain does come, it's that really intense, heavy rain that brings its own challenges in terms of runoff and erosion. And we're seeing flooding patterns change from what you'd consider normal winter flooding in rivers to actually flooding that happens when you wouldn't expect it, perhaps in later spring or even in summer, when it can be really problematic. So we're having to deal with all of those issues. And the way we kind of approach that, particularly at the landscape scale with our cluster members, is to use the farmer's own knowledge about where some of the challenges are specifically on their land. We're using data that's available to us, for example, surface flood risk maps, which are available online or through your CSF advisor, really interesting. And we're ground truthing it as well, so actually going out and looking and seeing where some of these challenges are happening. And then identifying, once we've identified where those risk areas are, implementing appropriate measures there. And the other aspect that I'd bring in that we're really keen our farmer clusters do and farms do themselves is on-farm measuring. So once you've identified a problem, once you've deployed a measure to address that, actually how can you then measure the impact that's having? And I'll expand a few bits, some examples. So for example, thinking about the issue of water resources, of course, a lot of the topics we've just spoken about here about insufficient demand, so how can we make sure there's enough water to farm the way that we need to and produce the food that we need to? And some of that is addressing the obvious first in terms of, well, actually, can we reduce the amount that we need in the first place? So all of those issues that you were talking about just now in terms of making sure that your equipment is as efficient as possible, that you're making decisions based on good data, that your equipment is maintained. It's amazing how much water can go in a leak that you don't spot for a few days. All of those are the really obvious low-hanging fruit. You were talking about shade just now for your peppers, and I definitely am doing that on a field level with some of my farmers. So where, for example, we're doing some hedgerow restoration work, then that's a really good opportunity to put some more hedgerow trees in, if that's appropriate to the landscape character. In my area, we have a lot of ash trees in the landscape. We're probably going to lose quite a lot of those. So actually, it makes a lot of sense to put in those successors to ash to make sure that those trees are going to be in the landscape. They're going to be providing shade for stock in 20, 30 years' time and so forth. And we're also taking some of those principles in terms of making sure that our water requirement is as low as possible by giving our plants the best chance to find the water that there is. And for example, in a grassland system, that might be about utilising diverse swards wherever we can. diverse swards with a number of different species that all have different rooting patterns, some of which will go very deep, some of which will go laterally. And not only does that give your plants the best chance of finding the water that might be quite far down in your soil, but it's that resilience word. It's spreading the risk and not putting all of your eggs in one basket. And that works especially well if you are able to combine it with leaving those swards to be longer. So you can do that, through example, through rotational grazing, which I know has been a topic here today. That longer sward obviously keeps the soil cooler and reduces the rate of evapotranspiration, so you're losing less water. We can also look at increasing the supply of water on our farms. So, and this is going to come back to the soil, I'm afraid, Claire, because this is the number one biggest asset on our farms to do this in. And again, it's so easy for our farmers to do, but it needs attention, it needs time. So actually, if we're going to store water in our soils, we need to pay attention to the structure of those soils. We need to identify any areas of compaction and address those. We need to be looking at our soil organic matter, because that's where the water is stored, in the organic matter, in the pores between the soil. And I'm reliably informed by good scientists that for every 1% of soil organic matter that you can increase in your soil, you will store up to 354,000 litres per hectare in the top foot of soil. That's an enormous quantity. And it's free, it comes from the sky. So we really ought to be making the most of investing in our soils to make sure that water is there when we need it. Some of the no-brainers, a lot of my farmers have been utilising helpful grants to invest in rainwater harvesting systems, which are great. We have big roofs. If you're using water for washing off kit and you're on mains water, then that is a very sensible investment in the long term. And increasing supply through other on-farm water supplies. But in terms of managing the other side of the coin, when you have too much water, we're talking about managing flood risk, and this is where we start dipping into things like the Natural Flood Management NFM toolkit. It is about field drainage, that topic that nobody talks about in things like this, but your field drainage can only work as well as it was designed to if your soil is healthy. So again, the flip side is to deal with issues of drought, to deal with issues of flooding, your soil is your first stop, making sure that the structure is good and your soil organic matter is as good as you can get it. And again, the same principle applies to diverse swards, diverse rooting structures, taller swards. We had a really interesting example, actually, near where I am, of a gentleman who was farming in the river floodplain. Traditionally, it would have been hay meadow. It had been farmed as set stock pasture for probably about 20, 30 years. And actually, the pattern of flooding of the river has noticeably changed in the last 10 years. So rather than fairly brief winter floods, we're now getting water that sits on those fields for much longer. And what we were finding quite rapidly is actually the set stock pasture grass couldn't cope with being sat under that water for that period of time. And it just died. And it was like a moonscape. It was quite horrific. And so actually what we've started to do is bring back some of those diverse species, those deep-rooting plants, moving to rotational grazing, possibly hay meadow making. So actually doing some nature restoration, but it's been driven by the need to cope with this changed flooding regime, which I find a fascinating way around to do it. The other aspect to this, which you talked about protecting our water resources, is of course not just about quantity, but about quality. And our water quality is a really important aspect for a lot of the clusters that I work with. We've been empowering people to do their own quality testing. So obviously you'll be aware that the likes of the Environment Agency and water companies will do their own. But actually we've been able to give farmers these little nitrate and phosphate pack tests, and encouraging them to go out and say, where's the water coming onto your farm? Where's the water going off your farm? Test it. See what's happening for yourself. And that's been really interesting. We found some very clean puddles. Really interesting snapshots in time that the farmers themselves can see for themselves what's going on. I won't go too much into water quality because it's a whole other topic. But I'd say my sort of top 3 tips would be keeping your soil in your field is what everybody wants, but you've got to go out when it's pouring with rain to check that it's actually staying where you want it. Go out when it's teeming with rain. That's when you'll spot any issues. Have a look around your yard. Where are those areas where rainwater could become contaminated and then turn into pollution that you don't want? Can we keep that rainwater out of those areas, like chemical stores, like your silage clamps, like where your livestock is feeding? And again, there's grants to help you with this at the moment. Where do your yard drains go? It's always a really interesting question. And the last thing I would say is increasingly, the farms that I'm working with, we're having to plan for extremes. So the sorts of weather patterns that wouldn't have been imagined 10 years ago, we are now seeing happening in terms of extreme rainfall. So plan for it. Again, making use of features so that when those extreme events happen, you are not suddenly left with a problem. So moving beyond simple buffer strips into things like bunds to keep water out where you don't want it, moving to swales so you can store water in a safe place, and cross drains across tracks. All of these things are totally doable. It's just thinking about your farm in a slightly different way and thinking about what's going to happen over the next few years. Plan for it now.
Thank you, Kirsty. And particularly thank you for noting, I think we talk a lot about availability and quality, but actually things like land drainage are really very important too. And I was talking to a farmer recently who invested quite significantly in some improved land drainage in their fields and actually improved their yield by around 30% in those fields. And it will more than pay off over time. So I think that's really important to understand that too. Coming from Leith, it would be remiss of me not to pick up on the point of plans. So thank you very much, Kirsty, for that segue. So I'd love to talk a little bit about what those future plans might look like for each of your businesses or the farmers that you're working with. In your case, Kirsty, in terms of adapting to those kind of security issues or how we might collaborate better, some of those really smart, innovative strategies that are on the horizon. It'd be great to hear about, what your plans might look like. Chris, can we start with you?
Yeah, so I think the next steps for us are continuing that journey of resilience. We grow a lot of our fruit in Spanish tunnels. I don't know if you're familiar with Spanish tunnels or not, but they're a temporary polytunnel structure. Actually, the latest iteration of polytunnels that we're putting in are permanent structures, and they have inbuilt rainwater collection on the roof. So I think I mentioned earlier that our average rainfall is about 500 mils. If we get an above average year, if we get just over 600 mils, about 610 mils, that gives us total self-sufficiency of rainwater harvested versus the requirements of that particular crop. So, that for us is a sea change and points the way forward for us. Now, picking up on the land drainage point, we've done some work with our local water company recently. They've supported us in terms of putting in catchment ponds. And we've actually, on our Spanish tunnel area, it's not as effective. It's not 100% capture of the water. All the water that drains from the plants we're already recycling and reusing. But now, all the water that falls onto our Spanish tunnels, we've put in fairly extensive drainage on the fields, and we're starting to capture all of that water as well. And beyond that, it's about the intelligence of the systems that we're using. So, it's all about application of technology. It's about attention to detail to try and minimize our water usage. So to set that into context, I understand that to produce a kilo of beef takes about 15,000 litres of water. To produce a kilo of wheat takes about 1,500 litres of water. 5 years ago, for us to produce a kilo of strawberries was taking us 150 litres of water. We've now got that down to just below 50 litres of water per kilo. So, with the application of technology, there are huge opportunities out there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And Mark, can I put the same question to you?
Thank you, Claire. I think for Tangmere, it's looking at actually our Spanish site and looking at the pressures that's under water-wise. And what we've seen is, as I said earlier, we've been there 20 years. And what we have noticed is that it's in central Spain, in Extremadura. And our water source for the crop was a local dam that was built however many years ago, and it was a fairly plentiful supply, and availability was good for us. So there was no real issues with water, and it was of a reasonably good quality. However, over time, the Spanish government, or at least the local government of that area, have persuaded growers to change their cropping, because when we arrived, there was, thousands of hectares of rice being grown. So there was umpteen hectares of paddy fields. And now you won't see a paddy field anymore, because the government had a chat with the growers and said, we can't carry on like this anymore. We don't have the water to sustain this way of growing. So the growers have diversified into other crops that are less water demanding. And as a business, we reacted to that by making the reservoirs where we were collecting the rainwater from the roofs of our glass houses and using that with the dam water. What it did mean is that we need to filter the water, but also to use an ultraviolet filter as well. So not only the physical contaminants, but also the pathogens that might be present in the water. So that's how we reacted in Spain to the challenges that we were facing. And of course now we're seeing in the UK, we're not quite at that extreme, but there's definitely a lot of pressure on the water where we are locally. And at the moment, we source all of our water from a borehole, and the water that falls on the roofs of the glass houses goes into reservoirs, but it just naturally drains away. And we don't utilise that. And I can see coming up in the future that we will need to utilise that water as well, if the borehole starts to become more difficult to actually extract from it, or there are limitations put on us to actually how much we can take from it. So, because there does seem to be an awful lot, I don't know about yourselves, but there's an awful lot of house building going on where I live and where the nursery is. So the pressure on the water supply is great. But we do have the storage in the rainwater reservoirs, and we could easily turn that into complementing with the borehole. So I think that's the main way. And I think the other side of it as well is, and it's funny that Chris had mentioned some technology from Israel, because we had some technology from Israel as well. But the technology that we had was the ability to look at the way water moved up the plant and the way that the fruit developed on the plant. So you could actually see that during a period of water stress, that the peppers would actually shrink very slightly as the plant protected itself. You can't see it with your eye, but the plant is closing itself down. It's protecting itself because the environment is getting harsher, so it's protecting. You can use shade and like that, but we were actually able to see fruit development and also the movement of water up the plant as well. So there's a lot of very good work going on, and I think we need to understand how far we can take the plant before we take it too far, and that's still it's unknown really at the moment. But there is a lot of work being done on it, because we've got a lot of control over it. We control how much water the plant has, and we control what's in the water that the plant has. Then we can also look at how much, because actually it's a benefit to the plant potentially to give it less, but how much less can we do? How much less can we do with no penalty? So
that's fascinating. Thank you, Mark. And Kirsty, can you perhaps adapt that question in terms of the farmers that you're working with in clusters or at landscape level? What kind of smart ways of working together, collaboration, and innovative strategies are you seeing in the future?
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's for me some of the stretch opportunities, if I kind of phrase it like that, would be around using some of the getting more bang for our buck. So if we're doing, for example, on-farm reservoirs, Can we use that to deliver wildlife habitat as well? Can we use that to deliver maybe floating solar panels? I know some people have played with. So where are those win-wins in things that we're doing that are driven by water, but might provide opportunities to do other things as well? And I can think of a reservoir near me, actually, that's also a reed bed and works fantastically well. For me, some of the interesting opportunities are around, for example, water companies who will very often have some interesting innovation funds for things that can't be funded otherwise. So as clusters, we're now looking around and going, okay, what would we like to do? What's stopping us from doing that? Where can we find the support? And some of these interesting pots of money that exist could be really helpful, but you have to know that they exist and access them. The last, I would say as well, when we're doing things like on-farm water features, and again, this is something we can do at a landscape scale, whether it's something quite as simple like ponds or something more complex like river restoration. Those are some of the things that I think are definitely where we're stretching towards over the next sort of 5 years or so. But I'm also very keen to build in control wherever possible, because I think having that ability to adapt to an unpredictable environment, whether that's unseasonal flooding, you want to keep water or you want to get rid of water, you're going to need control structures to do that. And I'm not keen on ripping up things irrevocably. And the last thing I would say is, in our experience, catchment partnerships have been tremendously helpful. So if you don't know who your local catchment partnership lead organisation is, find out what they're trying to do, work out where you have common interests, because they're looking for people on the ground who can help do some of this stuff. And there's fruitful discussions to be had about working together.
Thank you, Kirsty. I think that's a really great example as well of that multi-stakeholder approach and how that applies so well to water, actually, in terms of, and I think some great examples in terms of the research and the technology that you can take from other countries, but then also how you can engage locally with water companies and catchment funding and things like that. So, yeah, thank you for all of those great examples. So I would like to open it up to the audience now. So please do raise your hand if you have a question for anybody on our panel.
Hi, thank you very much. It's very interesting. My name's Dominic. And yeah, I was just wondering, a lot of companies at the moment are talking about going carbon neutral and such like, and more companies are now stating water positive goals. Sounds like you've got enough of an understanding to be on that journey yourself. Is it something that your companies might be looking at to create a water positive goal within the next decade?
Thank you. That's a great question. Mark, can we turn to you for that one?
Yeah. Particularly with carbon or water, either of them, I think we are moving as a business quite quickly, and I think the microphone's okay. We're moving quite quickly towards that point because, in one way, we are being forced because of the value that's attached to fossil fuels. So we have to wean ourselves off of those, and we have to do that very quickly. So in one way, that agenda, where it was something where there was an interest in it, but it was something that was a little bit further back, now it's come to the fore. So actually growing with less energy is very, very important because of the value of it, but the need to achieve sustainability. So I think what we're seeing is, we saw it in the design of greenhouses, and we'll see it in the way that we grow in the glass houses as well. And yes, we will be growing lower and lower amounts of carbon into it. With water, I think again, we need to show we're using it responsibly. So we will need to be more aware of how much we're using and the amount that we're producing, and showing that we're on that journey of reducing it. Because we're going to be forced into it at some point in the future. So let's be ready for it, and let's learn from other countries where they are already under much more extreme pressure than we are. Take some of the knowledge from there and be able to use that, because glass houses are fantastic structures for growing, and you see them all around the world. You see them in deserts in America. vast glass houses growing tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers, etc. You see them in Dubai, in the UAE, and like that. And they're a very versatile structure that can be adapted to meet the needs of the local conditions. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and there's some very innovative. I've heard of condensation harvesting systems. So where the condensation hits the inside of the glass as the plant is transpiring, that's captured and then that's used as well. So there's an awful lot of technology, but I take your point with actually recording it, reducing it, but I think we will be heading towards carbon neutral faster than we realise.
Thank you, Mark. Chris, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think in terms of water positivity, I think we have perhaps been a little bit slow to fly that flag. I think, you know, I think we've got an awesome story to tell, and as we've achieved resilience, particularly in very recent years, I think it's something we need to do more of, particularly farming in the part of the world that we are farming in. We are, amongst other things, we're a royal warrant holder, and with the demise of her, or the death of Her Majesty the Queen, we have to reapply for our royal warrant, and there's a huge and absolutely massive sustainability piece around all of that, and water for us forms a very significant part, as does energy, but that's a whole different story. We're just about to put in quite a sizable chunk of solar to supply our energy needs on site, looking at, you know, efficiency of kit, all that kind of stuff. But are we flying that water flag well enough and telling that story well enough? I think there's more for us to do.
Thank you, Chris. Kirsty, how high up the agenda is our water positive targets for the farmers that you're working with?
It's a really interesting question, because I think in the way you'd phrase it, they'd probably look a bit puzzled and go, really? But if you say, how about flood resilience, that would be very topical. For particularly the people that I'm working with. So I think it's just about which side of the coin people are most focused on at any particular point in time and space.
Yeah. It's the framing almost, isn't it? So yeah, exactly, and how it fits into the context of all the other kind of elements like the carbon and soil and biodiversity, etc. Thank you so much. Can we take any more questions from the audience?
Hi, my name's Judy. You mentioned about a lot of buildings going up around you and housing estates and everything, and they are around us, unfortunately, but it's causing a lot of problems with them building on the floodplains and therefore causing even more problems with flooding in particularly areas you wouldn't expect it. My question to you is there any way, particularly your glass houses, could utilise that water and store it and clean it and reuse it, or is it too contaminated to use and therefore wasted regardless of the houses?
Brilliant, thank you. Chris, do you have any ideas on that?
So we've already done that twice. It's not without its problems. We've had two very significant residential developments which we did approach the developers on and have channeled the surface water runoff back to ours. But it's not without its problems, because you get people washing down their cars on their driveways. You get all the associated cleaning products that are used therein. If somebody has a leak of oil in their driveway and that comes back to your reservoir, you need catchment traps in place to catch all of that. So we are doing some of that with a little bit of trepidation. It's not a problem-free solution.
Brilliant. Mark, have you got any experience of that at all?
I've definitely got experience of seeing very large amounts of water in places that I hadn't seen it before, and innovative developers putting houses where people have said to me, you can't build there because it's a floodplain. So as a company, it doesn't directly impact on us where we are. However, within the locality where we are, it does seem a pity that we couldn't, as Chris sort of said, that we couldn't capture that water, and I think maybe inevitably we will have to capture it, store it, and then be able to use it, because it does seem quite not the best thing when we look forwards to what's ahead of us. And we do have a lot of what we seem to do is have a lot of water suddenly, rather than a more controlled amount. And we do need to learn to live with that, where to put it, but also how to make sure that it's suitable for irrigating crops, because our expectation for the crop is fairly high. So we need to be really reassured with the systems we have in place that we can reuse that. So yes, I think sometimes the houses have got ahead of anything else in some ways, and then we go, hang on, we built them, now where's the water going to go? We're on a plain, so it's very, very flat where we are, and everything obviously goes towards the sea. But yeah, I see your point. I'm not sure in the short term what will happen, but I think in the long term, but I think potentially, I mean, if I go back historically, the reason that we built the nursery where we built it was because we were in an area of high light. Now, you need as much light as you can get when you're growing crops in greenhouses. The other reason was because we're quite near the coast. We're about 7 miles from Bognor. Now, that gives you humidity. The sea gives you humidity. Now, if you've got humidity and you've got light, you've also got the sea as a buffer. It acts as a buffer. So the temperatures that you get are not too high and not too low. It's absolutely perfect for glasshouse crops. It's probably one of the best places in the world to grow. There are other places around the globe, but it's a particularly unique area. High light, not too much of a temperature variance, and you've got humidity. So all of the ingredients. However, the residential and also as well in light industrial development, it means that maybe in the future, as a person wanting to build greenhouses in maybe 5-10 years from now, you're going to be looking at somewhere that's well away from everybody else. It will give you some other challenges, but your isolation is what you're looking for. I don't really want to end up in the middle of a housing estate. But we need to do something with the water, yes.
Thank you for that. And I think we've got time for one more quick question from the audience.
Thank you. How easy is it to create ponds? Like, is there any leak? If I just, like, we get a lot of water, massive amounts of water in the winter, and in the summer we haven't got enough soil to sustain much. So if I could, say, put ponds in and catch the winter water and use it through the summer, where would I go to find out how to do that? How to make that work, or even if it's doable?
Thank you. That is a great question. Kirsty, do you have any advice on that at all?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a great concept. So I think the first thing I'd say is, from a pure wildlife point of view, it's no bad thing if your ponds dry up. I speak to a lot of people who are very anxious about their ponds drying up in the summer. Actually, from a wildlife point of view, that is not a problem. There's plenty of things that actually prefer ponds that are seasonal to ones that are hold water all year round. However, it's not quite what you were saying. Depending on the size and the location of your pond as well, there are a few things that you might need to check to make sure that you are working within the consents that might be required. So, for example, work in floodplains tends to need consent from the Environment Agency. But as a rule of thumb, small ponds outside of the floodplain that aren't connected to anything are relatively easy to do. But I would, if I had to flag one really good source of advice, it would be to look up the Freshwater Habitats Trust Million Ponds Toolkit, because they have a massive range of advice on ponds in the landscape, and one of them is a very helpful checklist of things to think about when planning your pond, and it includes exactly the sorts of things you were asking about, in terms of, do I need consent, who from, what type of things. But it will be site-specific to where you have in mind. I hope that helps.
Brilliant. Oh.
Trust. And what was the second thing?
Their Million Ponds Toolkit.
Thank you.
I put in a large pond, kind of almost a hectare on my farm, and it needed planning, and the planning is on area, so the planning cost me nearly £3,000 just for the pond, just for the planning. That's before I put the digger into the ground. Nearly a hectare. Yeah. Well,
So-
I mean, probably not quite 0.7 or something.
Yes, Chris?
Sorry,
It's quite off-putting for
just to
farmers
pitch in there, because we've built a couple of pretty substantial reservoirs, one of them 5 acres, so 2 hectares, which we did under permitted development rights. But the planners are blissfully unaware of the relevant sections of the planning law, and you have to lead them at absolutely every step.
So what you're saying is, if you call your pond a reservoir, then I mean, if it's big enough, obviously as well.
It's, well,
then
I mean,
it
it's
might be
storage
permitted
of
development.
water. So I'm not a planning consultant, but we
Try it, right.
we got ours through on that basis. I don't think it should make any difference. I don't know. Maybe it does, but you just need to drill down into the planning regs, and I can't remember what subsection of the planning regs it is, but there is a section under permitted development rights that will allow you to, I think you can go up to 5 acres from memory.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to round up there. So in summary, I think we've established how smart water management underpins all aspects of an integrated farm management approach. We've heard how it can be applied in lots of different scenarios, and I think we need to look forwards towards some clearer advice on measurement and metrics and how we might define sustainable water management better. But clearly there's a lot of great thinking on the horizon and moving forward. So yeah, and I just want to thank the panel today, Chris, Mark, Kirsty. I think that's been a really interesting and different perspectives as well. So thank you all very, very much. Thank you all for hanging on in there to the end of the day for this talk. Please do reach out to Leaf, Linking Environment and Farming, if you want any more help with your water management. And if we don't know the answers and we can't help you, then we can point you in the direction of those that can. But just to wish you a safe onward journey, and thank you again for joining us today.